Hello, I'm Randy LeCoq, retired Foreign Service officer. I've done a couple other podcasts with John, one on the Battle of the Bulge. He and I did a book together on that. And also did one on Africa and Russia, my Foreign Service experiences. But today is special. Today is 4th of July, 2025, 250th anniversary of American independence. Very important day, and have my flag flying out front here in Helena. And so I'd like to share with you, if John is willing, my studies I've done, paper I've done on the American Revolution. It's quite a great story to hear, especially today. First part of my paper covers the buildup, the road to the revolution, which is Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War. After that, I have a second phase where I study the implementation, the Constitutional Convention and ratification, the presidency of Washington and Adams, where they sort of defined what the Constitution really was going to be in operation. So I think if you don't mind, I think I'll read from my paper and just give you a feeling for the American Revolution. Following the French and Indian War, Britain abandoned its 150-year-old policy of allowing virtual autonomy, local self-government, to the American colonies and permitting local assemblies in the past to run their own fiscal matters. Now London is beginning to enact new laws and leveling taxes on the Americans. Up until then, the 13 colonies had weaned power away from the Crown's agents. The colonial assemblies in America had grown in power and confidence and felt equal to England's Parliament. They supported the King in Parliament, but didn't want intrusion. The other British colonies around the world were, by contrast, overseas extensions of the British Empire rather than mature societies. They had no history of religious dissent. They were not politically informed like America. They were also more dependent economically, relying on the Crown for funding and for development, and having generally weaker economies. The British claimed that the change in British colonial policy in America was needed to pay for the French and Indian War, which had just ended in 1763. And to provide for additional troops against native uprisings on the frontier. British Parliament accordingly passed the 1865 Stamp Act, the first revenue tax on the Americans. The colonies didn't see the need for more taxes, viewing the French and the Indian War as a joint endeavor, and that we shared the burden together already. The Americans protested that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies directly without consent from their own elected bodies. No taxation without representation. Englishmen have this right. We said the Americans should enjoy this right as well. The British were shocked by the American reaction. Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was our colonial agent in London, was also a bit surprised and could only explain to the British that his countrymen must feel their privileges and liberties were, as English subjects, lost or in danger. To better understand the American attitude, we need to look at Britain's debate over the Declaratory Bill of 1766, giving Parliament the right to tax the colonies. Opponents of this act in Britain, backing the American position, argued that the bill was a violation of the British Constitution, which itself was grounded on the laws of nature, and that taxation and representation were inseparable, since a man's own is absolutely his own, and no man has the right to take it from him without his consent. This, they argued, was the distinction between liberty and slavery. Part of the reaction, the American reaction, to the new taxes was economic, explained by their effect on Virginia planters and on New England merchants who were operating on the margin and heavily in debt to British and Scottish creditors. Part of the opposition to taxes was ideological, based on the current Enlightenment ideals and Britain's own liberal tradition. British history itself, as you know, was well known to the British settlers in Massachusetts and Virginia in America, the English settlers. The British history was a struggle between monarchy and popular authority, in other words, the Parliament, over the issue of representative government. Britain's Glorious Revolution of 1688 was a rebellion against these absolutist tendencies of the Stuart kings, leading to civil war and actually to the execution of Charles I. This was followed by restoration of the Stuarts under William of Orange, who had to agree to uphold the English Declaration of Rights, limiting the sovereign power and protecting Parliament and individual rights. What resulted was a limited monarchy based on the balance of power, with the executive checked by the bicameral Parliament, and a role for independent judiciary as well. American memories were long, and 1688 was not that far back from 1765. Britain was being a bit tyrannical, yes, but the colonies at this stage did not want revolution, merely reform. So they're not taking that further step of nobody's talking independence. They just want to reform, get rid of the taxes. The British never quite grasped the ideological aspect of the American revolt, feeling that they had the right to tax colonies. And being a monarchy, they never understood American enthusiasm for total self-government. To them, the Americans were sharing the benefits of British liberal democracy and its vast mercantile network. The revolution began with public anger in Massachusetts over taxes, and feelings hardened as Britain began to view the protests as insurrection, and they began to punish Boston. This led to a tit-for-tat situation with the other colonies joining Massachusetts. Although independence, like I said, was not the goal initially, British overreaction led to full-scale rebellion and military clashes in Massachusetts by April of 1775. That's still a little bit down the line. Let's take a look at the timeline. Just to review. 1765, Britain enacts the Stamp Act on paper products, the first revenue tax levied on the colonies. They're smart enough that with the opposition, they actually repeal that tax because it caused such an uproar. But they followed it with other taxes like sugar tax on West Indian molasses, which hurt the rum mart makers in New England. In Massachusetts, Sam Adams forms what he calls the Sons of Liberty, and the state issues a boycott on British goods. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses issues its, quote, resolves against paying the tax, and Patrick Henry makes this famous "If this be treason" speech in the St. John's Church in Richmond. The legislatures of the 9 colonies send delegates to a Stamp Act Congress in New York to protest. We're talking the Stamp Act only. And 2 years later, in 1767, the British Parliament passes another bill called the Townshend Acts, imposing additional duties on most commodities except tea. In reaction, Pennsylvania state legislature John Dickinson, a farmer and a lawyer trained in the law in England and married into a prominent Quaker family, writes one of the first protest tracts called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, acknowledging Parliament's power in matters concerning the whole empire, but claiming the colonies are sovereign in their internal affairs, making the tax unconstitutional. Massachusetts follows with a circular letter to all the other colonies, 12 others, asking for their support in boycotting British British products. So we have this Sons of Liberty formed. We got the "If This Be Treason" speech by Patrick Henry in Virginia, and we got John Dickinson writing a letter. And then Massachusetts issues what they call a circular letter to the other colonies asking for their support in boycott, We're talking boycott now. So things are getting tougher. King George III decides to take action to restore royal order. He sends 4,000 troops from Halifax to Boston. Boston's where most of the trouble is. George Washington at Mount Vernon writes a letter at the time to his fellow Virginian, George Mason. A letter, he says, what is to be done? Should we boycott British goods and support Massachusetts? He is becoming one of the first American nationalists and represents the largest colony, Virginia. Now we skip forward a couple of years and we end up with the Boston Massacre taking place after British troops are put in Massachusetts. A patriot band threatens British soldiers on the street. Some citizens are killed. And amid these tensions, John Hancock, an American merchant, one of his ships, the Liberty, is seized by the British for unloading contraband goods into Boston Harbor in avoidance of taxes, the Townshend Law. And the patriots get the ship back and they burn it. They imprison the captain of the ship. And so it's kind of the first big act, along with the Tea Party, of the act of defiance against the British. The Tea Party takes place a little bit later, a couple years later. But this Hancock ship is the first act of defiance. So what happens? More British troops arrive in Massachusetts, and other colonial assemblies like Massachusetts form their own committees of correspondence, where all these 13 colonies now have committees of correspondence that correspond with each other and coordinate with each other on these various crises. Pennsylvania, by the way, remains neutral. In 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party taking place, and Ben Franklin gets practically run out of London. He's our agent representing Pennsylvania and England. He's verbally attacked in Parliament for encouraging disloyalty against Britain. So you see, things are really heating up. It's a tit for tat. In response to the Tea Party, Parliament enacts the intolerable acts, we call them. They're called the coercive acts, which light the fuse. No town meetings are allowed in Massachusetts, no assemblies there. Martial law is imposed. The Boston Port Act closes the port. The Quartering Act allows housing of royal troops in private buildings under a new military governor, Lord Gage, Thomas Gage. A separate Quebec Act follows, reducing the opportunity for the colonies to expand westward. These actions radicalize and unite the colonies. Massachusetts issues a letter asking for a convention, they will call it the Continental Congress, to be held in Carpenter's Hall in September in Philadelphia. We're 1774 now. And colonial militias are formed. And Ben Franklin escapes from London on his ship, comes back. And colonial assemblies pledge resistance, armed if necessary. Delegates are being nominated for this Continental Congress in Philadelphia. This will take place in September. Virginia, the wealthiest and largest colony, is also starting to come undone, like Massachusetts. There, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, shuts down the House of Burgess for its support of Massachusetts. But he encounters resistance from the Virginia Tidewater aristocracy, the Randolphs, the Lees, and so forth, Harrisons. And they've been meeting, the aristocracy's been meeting at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. And it includes people like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. So again, committees of correspondence are formed to coordinate. Militias are formed and recruited, and the boycott of British goods is initiated. So Virginia's following Boston's pattern. In August, Virginia holds a provincial convention, the first in the colonies, which votes to send a delegation to the proposed Philadelphia Continental Congress, the one for all the colonies. They're the first state to say, okay, we're coming. You hold that Congress in Philadelphia, we'll be there with our delegation. They're voting to elect a delegate. So amongst the delegates from Virginia are George Washington, Patrick Henry, and young Thomas Jefferson, who, with the help of George Mason, drafts what we call the Summer Review. He called the Summer Review. Jefferson's draft provides guidance for the convention for the Virginia delegation, stating that taxes must be requested by our own legislatures and listing grievances, which are later outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Other colonies are holding similar provincial conventions to choose delegates. Governor Dunmore in Virginia retaliates. He threatens to free the slaves and burn Williamsburg, but he's forced to flee to a British warship off of Norfolk. Royal governors in the Carolinas warned London that Massachusetts grievances are now those grievances shared by southern states, southern colonies. Like Dunsmore, these governors in the Carolinas fear assassination. So that's the first step leading up to the problem. Now we come to the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence, phase 2. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5th, 1774, for 7 weeks in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall. It opened in the wake of British troops seizing armories in Massachusetts, and with the colony's Royal Governor Thomas Gage requesting additional troops to patrol and maintain order. So you see there's really kind of an insurrection starting to take place in Massachusetts. The British have seized the arsenals and sending more troops. So you have 55 delegates attending in Philadelphia in September 1774, First Continental Congress. The question on the table is how to respond to the intolerable acts, to the coercive acts, where they brought quartering troops and all this stuff. So 12 of the colonies are there. They are also trying to coordinate a joint strategy to resist Britain's post-Boston Tea Party policies. The delegates wanted reconciliation, but they agreed that even though we're not advocating open revolt at this time, we're still trying to reconcile. We're trying to reform Britain rather than radicalize things. Still, we think it's a good idea to start forming voluntary militias in the face of increased British coercion. The Virginia delegates, by the way, impressed the assembled with their bearing and their eloquence. And George Washington, who was a French and Indian War hero and major landowner, as we know, was recognized as a natural colonial leader. A Pennsylvania doctor and delegate, Ben Rush, who had been educated in medicine in Scotland and England, and was in contact with the Scottish Enlightenment, held discussions at his Philadelphia home with some of the hardline delegates, the ones who are really anti-British: George Washington, Tom Paine, Patrick Henry, and John Adams. In formal session, however, the convention president, Peyton Randolph, Virginia, found it hard to unite the cautionary Pennsylvanians, the volatile Bostonians, and the refined Virginians. And the meeting and nothing was really resolved at this First Continental Congress, except the creating of militias and making George Washington the commander. But a new forum had been created, nonetheless, Continental Congress. And it was set up to reconvene for a second session of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia the coming May of 1775. So that was a major accomplishment, getting a Congress together, and 12 state colonies are represented in there. The Second Continental Congress convened on May 10th, 1775. Things had changed a lot between the first one in September the year before. By the time the delegates arrived, Parliament in Britain had declared the colonies in rebellion and expanded troop levels. And in April, as you know, at Lexington and Concord, fighting had actually broken out between British troops and colonial militia. Resistance had actually turned into rebellion. John Hancock had replaced Peyton Randolph as the president of the Congress. And the main purpose of the Congress now was to decide on reconciliation or independence. Independence is the word being heard now. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania led the cautious moderates, arguing for a peaceful resolution with Britain and fearing that the separation from England would deteriorate into an impossible situation. Other moderate Whigs in the peace faction included Robert Livingston and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, a lot of New York delegates, Thomas Stone of Maryland, John Jay of New York. But you had the other group, you had the hardliners, and mainly led by John Adams, who was very blunt and opinionated, but a brilliant thinker and a great speaker. He dominated the debates and led the radical hardliners, tapping his walking stick and making points, saying we're already at war and pushing for armed resistance, but not quite yet mentioning the word independence. Other radicals included Elbridge Gerry, John Hancock, Sam Adams of Massachusetts, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Tom Nelson of Virginia, Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, Edward Pendleton of Virginia, and Samuel Chase and Charles Carroll of Maryland. John Rutledge of South Carolina spoke the most, along with John Adams and with John Dickinson. These are the guys who dominated the debate, those three guys, the three top trial lawyers in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. But most of the colonial delegations were still divided. Pennsylvania had the staunch Whigs, Ben Franklin, Robert Morris, and Benjamin Rice, opposing the more cautious Dickinson. Georgia was cautious on separation due to the fear of Britain stirring up the native tribes. Anglican Connecticut and South Carolina were also cautious. Congress finally allowed Dickinson, Pennsylvania, to draft what he called an olive branch petition to King George III, affirming loyalty to the crown, but setting out the colony's strong positions on taxation and on their rights. As it was debating the political situation, however, Congress was becoming a war Congress, and the task was now to support the colonial militias fighting in Massachusetts under General Artemus Ward, with Washington leading troops up there to help out. Battle of Bunker Hill took place in June, not long after the Congress started, leading to large British losses and a standoff in Boston. Lord Gage, the British governor there, wrote to King George from Boston that Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were in open rebellion, and New York, Pennsylvania, and the southern colonies were arming. The king, George III, was in no mood for an olive branch, and he told his minister, quote, "Blows must decide," end quote. So there's where we stand. And we're still 1 year from the Declaration of Independence. But nonetheless, the Continental Congress voted to form an army with George Washington in charge and to send them to Massachusetts immediately. Ben Franklin, by the way, immediately was dispatched to Paris to ask for assistance. And in November, another American force, the one with George Washington, went to Massachusetts, Boston, but another force was sent to Canada. And in January 1776, now we're past 1775, we're in the beginning of 1776, still in the winter, Tom Paine writes Common Sense, openly raising independence from Britain for the first time and lighting a spark throughout the colonies. That publication lit the spark. Independence, that's the word. And that winter, the British burned Norfolk, by the way. And when the British started reacting tough like they did, the colonies were instructing their delegates, each of the colonies in Philadelphia, saying, okay, if you want to vote for independence, if you think it's necessary, do so. That was a break from the past because they'd been more cautious, like I said, in the past. Tom Paine's books seem to have turned the tide of public opinion. After winter break, we're getting up to May of 1776 now, Thomas Jefferson, with the help of Adams and Franklin, started on a draft Declaration of Independence over Dickinson's objection. Virginia planter Richard Henry Lee sponsored a bill in June to declare independence, and it was to be taken up for debate on July 1st. In the July 1st debate, John Dickinson, Robert Livingston, Robert Sherman, and Edward Rutledge opposed any declaration of independence. Samuel Chase of Maryland was working for acceptance, but it was not easy. Delaware and New York were divided. John Witherspoon and Richard Stockton arrived from New Jersey to replace the moderate holdouts. So things are turning a little bit. The moderates who are holding out for peace are being replaced in New York. New York was always divided. So anyway, they took a vote on July 1st after the debate, and they had nine ayes, yes, 2 noes, Pennsylvania and South Carolina, 1 abstention, New York, and 1 deadlocked, Delaware. So it wasn't quite a victory yet for the independence vote, although you had 9 yeses. There were a lot of big states who were saying no. But this changed with things were changing as they were voting. That day, sudden arrival in New York, people heard, of the British fleet with German mercenaries aboard. Mercenaries changed the picture, aroused colonial anger, and made support for the patriotic cause more urgent. With John Adams guiding the process and exerting his influence, John Dickinson and Robert Morris, who'd been moderates, abstained. They absented themselves. They went home, enabling Pennsylvania to vote yes. In South Carolina, Edward Rutledge, who had been a no vote for independence, switched to yes. In Delaware, Caesar Rodney rode his horse all night to break the deadlock in that state. It was deadlocked, you remember, for affirmative. So on July 2, another vote was taken and Lee's independence resolution passed, with 12 colonies voting yes and New York abstaining. 56 delegates signed the Declaration of Independence. Their names were kept secret until 1777. After they signed, John Hancock, who was the president of the Congress, stressed the importance of everybody hanging together now. Franklin added, "We must all hang together, or we will most assuredly hang separately." Forget the British troops were outside. Many of the 56 signers would, in fact, pay a heavy price for signing the Declaration. Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire, he ended up fighting for the militia at Saratoga battle. He had his house burned while he was away fighting. Abraham Clark of New Jersey had 2 sons jailed on a British prison ship while he was fighting. George Clymer of Pennsylvania had his wife and children hide in the woods while the British vandalized his home. William Ellery of Rhode Island saw the British destroy his home and property in Newport. William Floyd of New York saw the British plunder his lands and drive his family into exile in Connecticut. John Hart of New Jersey saw the British burn his farms and mills. While he was in exile, his children were scattered and his wife became ill and passed away. Thomas Hayward of South Carolina was a militia leader. He was captured in the British siege of Charleston, and his plantation was plundered and his slaves taken. Francis Lewis of New York saw his wife die due to British imprisonment. Thomas Lynch of South Carolina, a captain of the South Carolina militia, came down with fever and died when the ship he was escaping on floundered. Arthur Middleton of South Carolina was also captured during the siege of Charleston and was imprisoned from 1780 to 81 as his plantation was razed. Lewis Morris of New York, a brigadier general in the New York militia, had his home, Morrisiana, sacked and his family was forced to flee. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, who financed the revolution, died in debtor's prison after the war. Thomas Nelson of Virginia, also a big donator to the rebel cause, militia commander at Yorktown, suffered huge financial sacrifices. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina was a militia commander. He was at Charleston siege and was imprisoned until 1781, when the war ended, for all practical purposes. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured during the British invasion of New Jersey and imprisoned at Perth Amboy, where his health was destroyed. His plantation, Morven, was burned. George Walton of Georgia was wounded in the British siege of Savannah and imprisoned for a year. John Witherspoon of New Jersey lost a son in the war. So there was a lot of suffering. They paid a price, these 56 guys in Philadelphia. So now Next station, I will get into the war. We'll talk about the war. We'll do a summary of the war, moving from Boston and Canada down to New York and through New York and New Jersey, and then into the campaign around Philadelphia, and then on down to the south, to South Carolina, up to Virginia. So we'll cover it in detail, and I have colored maps to go with it, which we've made. So that will be our next station, if you're interested. Thank you.